My name is Beverly Thornton, and for the past 12 years, I've dedicated my life to protecting children, especially those trapped in painful, complicated family situations. As a child psychologist, I see the invisible bruises, the silent cries, and the broken trust that too many kids carry with them every day. My work isn't just a job. It's a calling born from personal experience. Because the most vulnerable child I've ever tried to shield isn't a stranger, I'm talking about my youngest sister, Emily. Emily is only 8 years old, and from the moment she entered our fractured family, she's been the one who suffers most quietly. It's strange, in a way, to talk about family on a professional level, to dissect the kind of pain I've witnessed from the inside, but that's the reality I live with. While I help hundreds of kids navigate their trauma, I struggle to protect my own sister from the neglect that's been normalized where we come from. Our family isn't the typical picture of warmth and unity. My parents, Robert and Linda Thornton, have long been caught up in their own world, often prioritizing appearances and control over genuine care. Mark, my older brother, is the so-called golden child, the favorite who seems to glide through life with their unwavering approval. And then there's me, caught in the middle, acting as the emotional buffer, the unofficial mediator, the one who always tries to hold the pieces together. It's exhausting. Every family gathering, every holiday, every conversation feels like walking a tightrope. I'm constantly trying to navigate the undercurrents of favoritism and dismissal, trying not to let the toxicity spill over into Emily's world. Because despite all the dysfunction, I cling to the hope that she deserves better, that she's worth fighting for. In my professional life, I spend hours listening to children who've been hurt by the very people who should protect them. At work, I know how to identify signs of neglect, emotional abuse, and trauma. At home, I see those signs staring back at me in Emily's tired eyes and small, slumped shoulders. It breaks my heart in ways that no textbook or training could ever prepare me for. Recently, the tension in our family bubbled to the surface in a way that no one could ignore. A family group chat, meant to coordinate plans and share updates, became a battleground of subtle jabs and cold indifference. I watched helplessly as Emily's needs were brushed aside, her feelings minimized, as if she was an afterthought in her own home. I tried to speak up, to advocate for her quietly, but my words were met with silence or thinly veiled resentment. Then the messages came. Shocking, cruel messages that cut through the thin veil of civility we'd maintained. "We left Emily at the airport. She'll learn a lesson," the text read, signed simply by Dad. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at my phone, disbelief mixing with a rising tide of fury and fear. How could they do this? How could they abandon an 8-year-old child in such a public, vulnerable place? The airport, a bustling crossroads filled with strangers, was no place for a scared little girl to be left alone. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run straight to her side. But I was frozen for a moment, grappling with the bitter knowledge that this wasn't an accident or a moment of poor judgment. It was intentional, a calculated punishment crafted by the people who should have been her protectors. That text marked a turning point. It shattered the fragile peace I'd been trying to maintain and forced me to confront the reality I'd been avoiding. My family wasn't just dysfunctional. They were capable of cruelty that I could no longer ignore or excuse. And Emily? She was the innocent caught in the crossfire, left to bear the weight of their selfishness. In that instant, I realized that protecting Emily would require more than just gentle words and quiet support. It would require action, fierce, unyielding action. But how do you fight the people who are supposed to love you? How do you protect a child when her own family turns their backs? As I sat there, heart pounding and mind racing, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let Emily face this alone. Not now, not ever. Growing up in the Thornton household was like living in two separate worlds, one where Mark existed in a steady bubble of approval and indulgence, and another where Emily and I were often invisible, left to fend for ourselves amid the cold currents of neglect. From an early age, it was painfully clear who held the family's favor. Mark, with his easy charm and athletic talent, was the golden child. He could do no wrong. Every achievement was celebrated like a triumph. Every mistake was met with gentle correction or quickly forgotten. In contrast, Emily and I were scrutinized through a lens of disappointment and unmet expectations. Our feelings, our struggles, they rarely seemed to matter. My father, Robert, ruled the house with an iron discipline that was as unyielding as it was emotionally distant. His brand of parenting wasn't warm or nurturing. It was rigid, strict, and unforgiving. I remember the sharpness in his voice whenever Emily cried or failed to meet his standards. There was no patience for softness or vulnerability. Tears were seen as weakness, and mistakes were met with cold reprimands or worse, silent punishment. I was often blamed for family troubles that had nothing to do with me. Whenever there was tension or conflict, Robert's default was to point fingers, and more often than not, I was the scapegoat. Meanwhile, Mark's missteps were brushed off with a smile or a quick excuse. The imbalance was glaring and relentless. Linda, my mother, was a very different force, but no less damaging. She was the enabler in the background, the one who smoothed over Robert's harshness and prioritized appearances above all else. Her silence was deafening. Whenever I tried to speak up about Emily's needs or the unfairness we endured, Linda deflected or dismissed me with practiced ease. It was as if acknowledging the cracks in our family facade would shatter the carefully constructed image she desperately wanted to maintain. She taught us, without words, that our emotions were inconvenient, and that maintaining public harmony came before personal care. I remember countless times when she would side silently with Robert's decisions, even when they hurt Emily or me, because it was easier than rocking the boat. Emily, being the youngest, bore the brunt of this dynamic in the most heartbreaking ways. She was isolated, often left out of family conversations, her feelings ignored or trivialized. Her small voice was lost beneath the louder, more demanding presence of her older siblings and controlling parents. I remember how, as a child, Emily would retreat into herself, clutching her little pink backpack like a lifeline, bracing against the cold world her parents created around her. While Mark thrived in the spotlight, Emily shrank away from it, her innocence and vulnerability overlooked by everyone except me. I tried, so many times, to make sense of it all, to rationalize my family's behavior as tough love or misguided efforts to prepare us for a harsh world. I told myself that Robert's strictness was a form of discipline meant to build character, that Linda's silence was protection in its own way. But deep down, I knew the truth was far bleaker. The neglect was not accidental. The emotional distance was not a gap, but a chasm deliberately left unbridged. The favoritism was not just unfair. It was a tool used to control and manipulate, to keep Emily and me in our place while Mark basked in unquestioned privilege. Looking back, it's clear that the neglect and exclusion we experienced were part of a pattern, one that robbed Emily of the childhood she deserved, and me of the family support I needed. This wasn't just about parenting styles or family quirks. It was about a cycle of dismissal and coldness that shaped every interaction and framed every expectation. And as much as I tried to hold on to hope for change, the harsh reality was that the toxic dynamics I witnessed as a child continued to grow stronger, casting a long shadow over Emily's fragile world and mine. Every time I saw Emily's face reflecting loneliness or confusion, I felt a pang of helplessness. It was an unspoken reminder that the protection she needed wasn't coming from the people who should have provided it. Instead, it was up to me to try and fill that void. But I also knew that rationalizing their cruelty only prolonged the damage. The truth was raw and undeniable. Our family's emotional neglect was a constant, and Emily's vulnerability was met not with care, but with cold indifference. This painful understanding set the stage for everything that would come next, because ignoring it any longer was no longer an option. Supporting Emily has been a constant thread weaving through the complicated tapestry of my life. It's not something I chose lightly. Rather, it became necessary. A role I couldn't abandon because deep down, I knew someone had to stand up for her. From the early days after Emily was born, I instinctively took on the role of her advocate. Even amidst the chaos and dysfunction, I tried to be the one person who made her feel seen and safe. My advocacy wasn't limited to words. I rearranged my entire schedule around Emily's needs, often juggling late meetings or rescheduling appointments to make sure I could supervise her after-school care. I remember those afternoons vividly, The sterile classroom where other kids laughed and shared snacks, while Emily sat quietly, clutching her small pink backpack, her eyes darting nervously around the room. It broke my heart, but I stayed with her, offering a steady presence to counterbalance the instability she faced at home. Financially, I stepped up without hesitation. When Robert and Linda struggled with their bills or chose to prioritize their own desires, I quietly covered Emily's school fees, extracurricular activities, and medical appointments. I knew these things mattered. They were not just expenses, but lifelines that allowed Emily to experience some semblance of normal childhood. I even set up a separate savings fund for her, hoping it might one day offer her a fresh start away from the toxic environment she was trapped in. Meanwhile, my husband Jason and our 2 children became part of this delicate balance. Jason's support was steadfast, but he also felt the strain. Our family dinners sometimes devolved into discussions about how to help Emily or how to respond to the latest drama with my parents. My children saw the tension too. There were moments when the heaviness of my family's issues clouded our home life. Despite that, they showed empathy beyond their years, always asking if Emily needed anything or if we could do more. Their innocent concern was a bittersweet reminder of how serious the situation was. Emotionally, I was often the one who absorbed the fallout. When Emily faced harsh words or was excluded from family events, I bore the anger and frustration quietly, shielding her from the worst of it. I became her emotional anchor, listening patiently as she tried to explain why she felt left out, holding her hand when she was scared, and reassuring her that she wasn't alone. Those moments were precious but painful, because I saw the toll the neglect was taking on her small shoulders. But not everyone appreciated my efforts. Linda especially seemed to resent my involvement. She treated my advocacy as interference, accusing me of overstepping boundaries and meddling in what she called parenting decisions. It was a cruel irony. Here I was, a trained child psychologist with years of experience, trying to protect a vulnerable child, and yet my own mother dismissed me as if I were an outsider. It stung deeply, this rejection from my own family, but I refused to back down. Mark, of course, never questioned the status quo. He walked through life with the family's approval, unbothered by the cracks beneath the surface. His silence spoke volumes. By ignoring Emily's struggles, he tacitly endorsed the neglect, leaving me to carry the weight alone. Despite these challenges, I clung fiercely to hope. I believed that if I kept showing up, kept fighting for Emily, eventually my family would recognize the damage being done and change course. I imagined a day when Emily wouldn't have to hide her feelings or be the family's afterthought. Maybe, just maybe, they would see her worth. But over time, the resistance only grew stronger. My efforts were met with cold shoulders, dismissive comments, and an unspoken message that Emily, and by extension I, were problems to be managed rather than loved. It was exhausting, a slow drip of rejection that eroded my spirit. Still, I persevered, because the alternative, doing nothing, was unthinkable. This relentless pattern shaped me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I became sharper, more guarded, learning to navigate the minefield of family dynamics with careful precision. Every phone call, every family gathering, every message in that group chat became a test of my resolve. I documented everything: texts, emails, incidents, quietly building a record that, someday, might protect Emily in ways words alone never could. Through it all, my focus never wavered. Emily's well-being was my North Star. No matter how much I was dismissed or how deeply I was hurt, I refused to let her slip further into neglect. I became her voice when hers was ignored, her shield when she felt exposed, and her hope when the rest of the family turned away. And yet, beneath the surface, a quiet storm was brewing inside me, a growing realization that hope alone might not be enough, that protecting Emily would require more than just sacrifice and quiet advocacy. It would demand confrontation, boundaries, and perhaps a reckoning that I hadn't yet fully embraced. But in that moment, as I balanced the demands of my career, the needs of my own children, and the turmoil of my family, I held on to that sliver of faith. For Emily's sake, I had to keep going. Because if I didn't, who would? The family reunion was supposed to be a chance for us to reconnect, to pretend, at least for a few hours, that the Thornton household was a warm, loving place. But beneath the polished smiles and forced laughter, the old tension simmered like a dormant volcano, ready to erupt at the slightest provocation. I arrived early, hoping to create a calm space for Emily, who clung to me with a nervous grip as we stepped into the crowded living room filled with relatives, cousins, and the usual cliques that made these gatherings feel more like minefields than celebrations. Linda was already there, perfectly coiffed and wearing that same look she always had when she was ready to defend the family's image at all costs, a thin veil of sweetness masking steel. Robert sat nearby, his arms crossed, scanning the room with the detached authority of a man who considered emotions irrelevant distractions. Mark was leisurely chatting with a few of his friends, seemingly unaware or uncaring about the undercurrents swirling around him. Almost immediately, the conversation shifted to Emily. Someone mentioned a school project she had completed, and I quietly tried to steer the talk toward her achievements, hoping to give her a moment of recognition. Emily's face lit up just a little, but the glow was quickly snuffed out when Linda scoffed from across the room. "She's fine. Just needs to learn some discipline," Linda said sharply, eyes darting toward me. Beverly's always meddling, trying to turn every little thing into a psychological crisis. It's exhausting. The words hit me like a slap. I stood there, stunned, as the room went awkwardly silent. I had spent years studying child psychology, dedicating my career to understanding and healing kids like Emily, kids who suffered in silence. Yet, here was my own mother dismissing my expertise with a flick of disdain, painting my concerns as meddling. I took a slow breath, steadying myself. "I'm not meddling, Mom. Emily's emotional health is important. She deserves to be seen and supported, not pushed aside because it's inconvenient." Robert's gaze shifted to me, cold and dismissive. "You're overprotective, Beverly. Kids need boundaries, not coddling. Maybe if you weren't always hovering, Emily would behave better." A sting of humiliation burned through me. Not just because Robert dismissed my professional opinion, but because his words implied that I was somehow failing my sister by trying to help her. Mark chuckled from the corner, smirking in that way that made it clear he took pride in siding with our parents, reinforcing the family's unspoken hierarchy. "I think Beverly's just jealous," Mark said, his tone light but cutting. "She's always trying to play the hero, but sometimes it's better to let things be." The others laughed, some nervously, some with genuine amusement. I felt the weight of isolation settle over me, a familiar crushing sensation that I was the outsider, the troublemaker, the one who never quite fit. Emily shrank back, clutching her pink backpack tighter, her wide eyes pleading silently for me to protect her. I forced a smile, masking the ache in my chest. Inside, I was furious, not just at Linda and Robert, but at the entire system that allowed them to dismiss Emily's pain so casually. "I'm not jealous," I said, voice low but steady. "I care about Emily, and if that makes me the meddler, then I'll wear that label proudly." Linda's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes narrowing. "You don't get to parent Emily. That's our job." "That's exactly the problem," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. "Because you're failing her." The room grew tense, the fragile veneer of civility cracking. I saw a flicker of something in Robert's eyes, annoyance, maybe even fear, that I was no longer willing to quietly accept their cruelty. The conversation moved on, but the damage was done. I knew then that the family's casual cruelty wasn't just a private pain, it was a public declaration of power, and I was no longer willing to be silenced or sidelined. That day, beneath the forced smiles and polite chatter, I felt a shift inside me. The hope for reconciliation faltered, replaced by a growing determination. The family's dismissiveness wasn't just misguided love, it was a deliberate refusal to change. And if they weren't going to respect Emily's well-being, or mine, I would have to find another way to protect her. The moment I saw the message, my heart dropped so low I thought it might shatter. It was a family group chat message from Dad. "We left Emily at the airport. She'll learn a lesson." No emojis, no explanation, just those cold, brutal words. My hands trembled as I read it again and again. disbelief crashing over me like icy waves. How could they do this? How could Robert and Linda, the people who should have been her protectors, abandon an 8-year-old child in a place full of strangers, an airport terminal buzzing with noise, announcements, and endless streams of people rushing past? I stared at the screen, fingers frozen over my phone. Then the next message popped in. "Come get her. We're boarding." From Mom. And just like that, the cruel truth crystallized. They had deliberately left Emily behind, alone, terrified, and utterly vulnerable, while they boarded a plane bound for Disney World, a selfish getaway that came at the expense of their own daughter's safety. The room around me blurred, the sound of my own ragged breath filling my ears. I could almost see Emily there, standing small and scared by the gate, clutching her pink backpack so tightly it was almost part of her, eyes wide and searching for the faces who were supposed to love her but were nowhere to be found. I imagined the cold airport floor beneath her feet, the harsh fluorescent lights overhead, the cacophony of strangers bustling by without a second glance. A flood of emotions crashed into me all at once. Shock, horror, rage, and a sickening ache of betrayal. Jason, sitting nearby, noticed my sudden silence and the way my face went pale. "Beverly, what is it?" His voice was calm, but I could hear the edge of worry threading through it. I showed him the phone, the messages glaring back like a slap. He didn't hesitate. This is criminal," he whispered, voice tight. "You have to do something." But I was frozen for a moment, the weight of what this meant pressing me down like an anchor. This wasn't a mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a calculated, deliberate punishment, a twisted lesson handed down by two adults who chose cruelty over compassion. I felt the full weight of my family's toxicity settle on my shoulders in that instant. This was the breaking point. I thought back to every time Emily had been brushed aside, ignored, or blamed for things beyond her control. Every tear she had hidden, every time she had been left out or silenced. But this was different. This was public abandonment, a betrayal so naked and cold it shattered any illusions I still clung to about my parents' love. My fingers clenched around the phone as a fierce resolve ignited inside me. This wasn't just neglect or emotional distance anymore. This was active harm, and I refused to stay silent, refused to let Emily suffer alone. I immediately dialed Mom's number, heart pounding wildly. The call rang out, unanswered. I called Dad next, also silent. No surprise there. I sent a message to the group chat. "Where is Emily? Who is with her right now?" The silence that followed was deafening. In that empty pause, the overwhelming reality sank in. My parents had cast my little sister away, expecting someone else to pick up the pieces while they escaped to their vacation. I could almost hear the echo of Mom's cold words from previous arguments. She has to learn a lesson. But what kind of lesson is leaving a child alone in a busy public space, exposed and frightened? Jason reached out, gently placing a hand on my arm, grounding me. "Let's go. We're getting her." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. There was no time to waste. My mind raced, calculating the fastest way to the airport, who to call, how to find Emily before anything worse could happen. Already, the images of her small figure alone by the gate burned in my mind's eye. I felt a fierce protectiveness surge through me, overriding the exhaustion and despair. Emily was my sister, my responsibility, the one person in that family who deserved safety, love, and care. And I realized right then that the cold, heartless choices of my parents had crossed a line I couldn't ignore. This wasn't just a family crisis. This was a reckoning. And I was the only one who could answer the call. I sat alone in the dim light of my living room, the silence pressing in around me like a physical weight. My fingers still trembled from the shock of the messages I'd just read, the cruel words from my own father, the cold dismissal from my mother. "We left Emily at the airport. She'll learn a lesson." Those words echoed relentlessly in my mind, twisting my gut into knots. I kept replaying that stark phrase over and over, as if by sheer repetition I could make sense of the senseless, but it remained brutal, unforgiving, and devastatingly clear. A swell of grief rose within me, Not just for that moment in the airport terminal where my 8-year-old sister stood alone, scared and abandoned, but for every single time I hadn't been able to protect her. For every tear she'd swallowed in silence, every hurt we'd both endured growing up in a household where love was conditional and neglect was the norm. The memories flooded back. Emily clutching her pink backpack tighter in the shadows of family gatherings, the way her eyes would dart nervously when my parents dismissed her feelings, the countless times I had tried to shield her from their coldness while quietly absorbing the pain myself. The grief was suffocating, but alongside it, an unrelenting clarity began to burn, a fierce, searing light cutting through the fog of denial I'd clung to for so long. The family's indifference wasn't a tragic accident or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was deliberate, calculated, a cruel strategy disguised as discipline or lessons. They had chosen to abandon Emily, to leave her exposed in a crowded airport, not out of forgetfulness, but because they believed she needed to be taught a harsh lesson, one paid for with her safety and dignity. I felt anger rise, hot and unforgiving, coursing through every fiber of my being. How could they be so cold, so blind to the damage they inflicted? And why had I, for all these years, allowed myself to be the family's emotional crutch, the one who absorbed their neglect while pleading for their empathy? The realization hit me like a tidal wave. I owed them nothing. No forgiveness, no patience, no more silent suffering. As I sat there, the house quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic outside, my mind raced through every sacrifice I'd made, every late night spent arranging care for Emily, every dollar quietly slipped to cover medical bills, every moment I swallowed my own hurt to stand up for her. I thought about the countless times my concerns were dismissed, the times my expertise was ignored, and the way my parents and brother had prioritized their own comfort over Emily's well-being. The pattern was undeniable. They weren't going to change. They never had. The weight of that truth settled on me, heavy but somehow freeing. If my family was never going to protect Emily, then it was up to me. The protective instinct I'd carried since childhood now sharpened into cold resolve. I wasn't just devastated. I was determined. Determined to stop excusing their cruelty, to stop bending to their denial, to stop allowing Emily to be their scapegoat. I could feel the storm building inside, a calculated energy fueled by love and rage. It was no longer enough to quietly advocate or hope they would see reason. The boundaries had to be clear, the consequences firm. If they wanted to teach lessons, then they needed to face the lesson I planned to give them: accountability. The room seemed smaller, darker as I sat with these thoughts. The silence pressed harder, but this time it was charged with purpose. I whispered to myself, barely audible, "They will never change. It's time they face consequences." The words were a promise, a vow I made to Emily and to myself. And yet, beneath that fierce resolve was a tender fear, the fear of how far I'd have to go, how much I would have to fight, and how broken everything might become before it could get better. But there was no turning back. The moment had come to stop protecting them and start protecting Emily, no matter what the cost. The night stretched on, but inside me, something had shifted irrevocably. The line between hope and harsh reality had been crossed, and on the other side lay a path I was both terrified and ready to walk. Because if I didn't stand up now, who would? Sitting alone at my kitchen table, the weight of the family's betrayal still fresh in my mind, I began to map out the reality I'd been living with for years, the tangled web of dependencies and enabling that kept my parents and brother afloat while Emily and I sank deeper into neglect. It felt like stepping into a battleground where every financial thread, every social tie, and every hidden secret could become a weapon or a shield. I pulled out my laptop and started listing what I knew, where the money came from, who relied on whom, and what leverage might exist beneath the surface. Robert and Linda, despite their bluster and rigid authority, were more fragile than they let on. They depended heavily on me, on my financial support to keep the house from falling into foreclosure, on Jason's consulting business for legal and business advice, when Robert's ventures teetered on the edge of collapse. It was ironic, really. The same people who abandoned Emily at an airport gate leaned on us to patch up their messes. Mark was a different but equally important piece in this puzzle. His social standing, his reputation as the golden boy, hinged almost entirely on the family's carefully maintained image. Beneath the surface, he was just as vulnerable to exposure and scandal as anyone else. I recalled moments when Mark's friends whispered behind his back, uneasy about the sharp edges beneath the Thornton family's polished veneer. If I could expose the cracks, expose the neglect and cruelty masked by smiles and social niceties, it would shake the foundation of his carefully constructed world. As I compiled this list, I also began gathering the evidence I'd quietly amassed over the years. Screenshots of text messages from the family group chat where Emily's needs were dismissed or belittled, photos of bruises or signs of emotional distress she tried to hide, medical records that documented the consequences of neglect, and emails where I'd warned my parents or attempted to intervene. Each piece was a fragment of a larger story, a story I was now determined to tell clearly and forcefully. The process felt both clinical and deeply personal. I was a psychologist by trade, trained to detect patterns of abuse and neglect, but this was different. It was my family. Every text I read, every photo I reviewed, was a wound reopened. And yet, beneath the sting was a growing fire of resolve. I realized I wasn't just collecting ammunition. I was building a fortress around Emily, a barrier strong enough to block out the ongoing harm. I knew I couldn't do this alone. Jason was my rock, steady and unwavering. Late into the night, I discussed my plan with him in hushed tones, aware of the gravity of what lay ahead. Jason agreed to help with legal consultations. His experience in business made him a natural ally in navigating the complicated terrain of custody and guardianship. Together, we found a lawyer who specialized in family law and children's rights, someone who could help us navigate the legal maze while keeping Emily's best interests front and center. We started the process of updating guardianship papers, taking steps to ensure that, should anything happen, Emily would be protected from the very people who had failed her. The legal jargon and paperwork were daunting, but each completed form felt like a small victory, a tangible step away from the chaos and toward safety. Meanwhile, I kept up appearances, attending family gatherings with a calm exterior that masked the strategic mind behind the scenes. I took mental notes during conversations, recorded moments of neglect or disregard as they happened, and stayed alert to the shifting dynamics. It was exhausting, but necessary. No one suspected that beneath my composed surface, I was orchestrating a quiet revolution. Every text notification, every glance at the group chat, was another piece of intelligence. I watched as Robert and Linda continued to act as if nothing had changed, relying on my support without so much as a second thought. Mark remained oblivious to, or complicit in, the growing storm. But I was ready. I was no longer the passive protector trying to hold the family together. I was the strategist, carefully mapping each move, each consequence, preparing to confront the toxic legacy that had left Emily so vulnerable. In those solitary hours of planning, the path forward became clearer. The reckoning was coming, and I would be the one to deliver it. But for now, the best weapon was patience, and a plan forged in quiet determination. The moment I decided to shift from protector to strategist, everything changed, at least in how I showed up. On the surface, I kept calm, played the role everyone expected, the dutiful daughter, the responsible sister. But beneath that composed exterior, I began to pull back, creating distance where before I had been so deeply entangled. The first subtle change was in communication. I started delaying my responses to calls and texts from my parents and Mark, calls that used to come at all hours, demanding updates or favors. Instead of answering immediately, I let the phone ring longer, sometimes until it went to voicemail. When I did reply, my messages were brief, neutral, and carefully measured. No more endless explanations. No more justifications for my absence or refusals. I wanted to protect my energy and create space to think clearly. Financial support, which had been a steady lifeline for Robert and Linda, also began to dwindle. I stopped covering the little extras, the school supplies, the fees for Emily's activities, the emergency copays. I rearranged my budget and redirected those funds toward Jason's and my family's immediate needs. When my parents asked about the missing payments, I deflected politely but firmly. I refused to fall into old patterns of enabling their neglect by rescuing them again and again. It was difficult. There was guilt, a nagging voice inside me reminding me of Emily's vulnerability, but I knew that without boundaries, I was part of the problem. Caregiving duties were another area where I quietly pulled back. Where before I would rearrange my schedule at the drop of a hat to supervise Emily's after-school hours or handle last-minute babysitting, I started saying no. I explained to them that my family commitments had changed, that I was swamped with work or my own children's needs. I stopped offering to intervene in family disputes or to mediate disputes over Emily's care. This was painful because I wanted to be there for Emily, but necessary. If they wanted to teach lessons, I would let them face the consequences of their choices. Behind the scenes, I took more decisive steps to protect Emily's safety and my own control over the situation. I changed passwords on all shared family accounts, the ones Robert and Linda had access to, the household bank, the utility bills, even the family calendar. No longer would they be able to manipulate or block important information. I set up automatic notifications to my phone for any transactions or changes related to Emily's care, ensuring I was always in the loop. I updated emergency contact lists everywhere Emily was registered: school, doctors, aftercare programs, removing Robert and Linda's names and replacing them with mine and Jason's. This was a significant step because it stripped away their ability to intervene or claim responsibility. When I informed the school administration, the social worker, and the pediatrician, I was met with understanding and quiet support. It felt like reclaiming a piece of control in a chaotic family landscape. Mark noticed these shifts. When he confronted me, his tone a mix of suspicion and entitlement, I kept my composure. "Everything's fine," I told him, voice steady but non-committal. Just some changes for Emily's better care. I wasn't ready to reveal the full extent of my plans, and I didn't want to give him any ammunition. He pressed a little more, but I deflected, aware that revealing too much too soon could backfire. Meanwhile, Robert and Linda seemed oblivious, or chosen to ignore, the gradual changes. They continued to act as though I was simply under stress or overwhelmed, whispering among themselves about how Beverly was cracking, or losing it. It was a tactic I anticipated. They'd prefer to dismiss me than confront the truth. This only made me more resolute. As I quietly built this new framework of boundaries, I was also moving forward legally. Jason and I consulted with a family lawyer who specialized in child welfare. We navigated the bureaucracy, filled out paperwork, and prepared to file for guardianship changes that would officially place Emily under my care. It was a difficult process, emotionally and logistically, but every form signed, every legal consultation completed, felt like a step toward safety for Emily, a step away from the neglect that had defined her life. Throughout all this, I maintained a calm exterior at family gatherings, masking the storm brewing beneath. I smiled politely, asked routine questions, and took mental notes of moments that highlighted ongoing neglect or cruelty. Every insult disguised as a joke, every dismissive glance toward Emily was cataloged in my mind and on my phone. I wasn't the same Beverly who would absorb the pain silently anymore. I was becoming a guardian, not just by love, but by strategy. In quiet moments, I thought about how strange it was to be simultaneously present and distant, involved and detached, but I understood that love alone wasn't enough anymore. This was war, waged for Emily's future, and patience, secrecy, and deliberate moves were the weapons I had to wield. The trap was set, and the family was unaware they were standing on the edge of collapse. The day of the confrontation arrived like a quiet storm, its tension building beneath the surface until it was impossible to ignore. I had arranged a family meeting at a neutral location, a small conference room in a local community center, inviting my parents, Robert and Linda, my brother Mark, and, most importantly, bringing along a lawyer and a professional mediator. My heart pounded as I watched them file in, their faces taut with confusion and a flicker of suspicion. None of them knew the full extent of what I was about to reveal, nor the meticulous preparation that had led to this moment. I started the meeting with a calm, measured tone, careful to keep my voice steady even as my pulse raced. "Thank you all for coming," I began, eyes scanning the room, lingering for a moment on Emily's absent seat. "We need to talk about what happened recently at the airport, about Emily's safety, and what it means for all of us moving forward." The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. Robert shifted in his chair, stealing a sideways glance at Linda, whose lips pressed into a tight line. Mark's usual smug confidence faltered ever so slightly. I pulled out my phone and, with a few deliberate taps, displayed the infamous group chat messages on the screen projected through the conference room's small projector. These are the words my father sent. "We left Emily at the airport. She'll learn a lesson." I let the weight of those words hang in the air, watching as disbelief and discomfort flickered across their faces. "I want to be clear," I said, voice firm. "This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate choice to abandon an 8-year-old child in a public place, alone, scared, and vulnerable." The mediator nodded solemnly, having seen the toll these dynamics take on families. "This action," I continued, "is not only neglectful, it's dangerous, and it has consequences." I unfolded the next part of my plan, holding up a thick folder filled with carefully cataloged evidence, screenshots of abusive and dismissive text messages, photos showing Emily's emotional distress over time, medical records documenting injuries and missed appointments, emails where I had pleaded for intervention, all the pieces that painted a damaging and undeniable picture. "This is the reality of what Emily has endured," I said softly, but with a strength that echoed through the room. "And despite my efforts to protect her, the neglect has continued." Robert's face twisted with a mixture of anger and denial. "You're making a mountain out of a molehill, Beverly," he spat. "We're her parents. We know what's best." Linda chimed in, her voice sharp and defensive. "You're trying to take control away from us." But I was ready. "Control isn't the issue," I replied. "Emily's well-being is. And from this moment on, I am revoking all financial support I have provided to this family. That includes the household bills, Emily's school expenses, and any other funds that have been used despite your neglectful behavior." The room stiffened. Mark's jaw clenched visibly. "You can't do that," he said, voice edged with disbelief. "You don't have that right." "I have every right to protect my sister," I said evenly, "and to ensure she is safe and cared for. That's why, with the advice of our lawyer, Jason and I have legally transferred guardianship of Emily to ourselves. From now on, her safety and needs will not be compromised by those who have shown they cannot provide for her." I watched as disbelief morphed into panic, then anger. Robert slammed his fist on the table. "You're tearing this family apart." "No," I corrected, feeling a quiet fire burn within me. "I'm saving her from this family's patterns of neglect and cruelty." The mediator spoke up, reminding everyone that the goal was to establish boundaries for the sake of the child's welfare, not to destroy family bonds unnecessarily. But the truth was clear. Respect and accountability were now non-negotiable. If my parents and brother wanted any relationship with Emily, they had to adhere to these principles. As the meeting closed, I felt a strange mixture of relief and tension. The family's facade had cracked wide open, exposing fractures too deep to ignore. I had drawn a line in the sand, one they could no longer cross without consequences. Walking away from the room, I knew this was only the beginning. The family's world was about to unravel, and I was the one holding the map to their reckoning. But one thing was certain: Emily's future would no longer be dictated by their neglect. It would be shaped by safety, love, and unwavering protection, and I was ready to fight for it. The moment I laid down the law at that family meeting, the fragile illusion my parents and brother clung to began to crumble like dry earth beneath a relentless drought. It was as if I had ignited a silent fuse, one that quickly sparked a desperate scramble to regain control. Almost immediately, my phone buzzed with an avalanche of messages, texts dripping with guilt, sorrow, even veiled threats, each one more frantic than the last. Robert's name lit up the screen repeatedly, his voice, messages shaky yet urgent. Linda's texts piled on, alternating between desperate apologies and cold reminders about family loyalty and not tearing us apart. But beneath the words, I heard the familiar undertone of manipulation, an effort to make me question my resolve, to pull me back into the cycle of enabling their neglect. I read each message with a growing sense of clarity. They wanted me to carry the burden of guilt, to dissolve the boundaries I had so carefully established. They wanted me to forgive and forget, to pretend everything was fine, to let them off the hook for abandoning an 8-year-old child in an airport terminal. But I was no longer that woman who absorbed their cruelty quietly. This time, I refused. Meanwhile, their attempts to manipulate Emily were desperate and painfully obvious. Packages began arriving. Gifts wrapped in bright paper, dolls and clothes that seemed designed to buy affection rather than show genuine care. At first, I thought maybe this was their way of making amends, but I saw through it immediately. Linda's voice on the phone was saccharine sweet, a stark contrast to her usual dismissive tone when talking about Emily's real needs. We just want to show her we love her, she told me, as if love were something wrapped in plastic and ribbons. But Emily's eyes told a different story. She was wary, confused, and guarded. I watched her carefully, noticing how she hesitated before accepting a present, how she glanced toward me as if searching for a safe harbor amid the storm. It broke my heart that their attempts at love were so hollow, so transactional. My husband Jason stood firmly by my side through it all. He faced the never-ending stream of calls and emails from my parents, his jaw clenched with frustration, but his voice measured when he spoke to me. They're trying to control the narrative, Beverly. They want to paint you as the villain, the one breaking the family apart. But you know the truth. Don't let their gaslighting shake you. His words were an anchor. Together, we fortified the walls around Emily's world, building a safe space where her healing could begin, away from the chaos and cruelty that had defined her home life for too long. Mark, too, felt the tremors of this unraveling. His carefully curated social image started to falter as whispers among his friends grew louder. The once untouchable golden child found himself facing questions about his family's integrity, his own complicity buried beneath layers of silence. I wasn't the only one documenting and observing anymore. Friends reached out, unsure what to believe, but unsettled by the cracks that were now impossible to disguise. The extended family, too, began to shift. Some relatives, long silent or indifferent, started to voice sympathy for Emily's plight and a tentative support for my stance. Others, however, urged us to keep the family together, clinging to denial and willing to overlook the damage for the sake of appearances. I listened to their voices but remained unmoved. The safety of a child was non-negotiable. The barrage of guilt trips, manipulation, and empty gestures only strengthened my resolve. Robert and Linda's fragile world was beginning to unravel, but their panic and attempts at control were futile. I had become the gatekeeper of Emily's well-being, and I was no longer willing to let their toxicity poison her life. In the quiet moments, when the noise of their desperate calls faded, I felt a bittersweet relief. The battle was not over. It was just intensifying. But for the first time, I was fighting on my terms. The family's old tactics no longer worked, and their power over Emily and me was slipping away. Looking at Emily's tentative smiles, her slow return to trust, I knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. But I was ready to walk it with her, no matter how fierce the storm became. Because this time, I wasn't just protecting a child, I was reclaiming her future. And that future would never again be held hostage by cruelty disguised as family loyalty. The fallout from that family meeting hit harder and faster than I could have anticipated. For years, my parents, Robert and Linda, had been leaning on me to keep their world from collapsing. But once I pulled back that lifeline, everything began to unravel. Almost immediately, their house, the home they'd tried so desperately to maintain as a symbol of stability and success, was threatened by foreclosure. Without my financial support to cover the mortgage payments and utility bills, the stark reality of their negligence came roaring to the surface. I had known they were struggling behind their carefully curated facade, but watching that house teeter on the brink of loss was a bitter pill to swallow. It was a tangible consequence of the choices they had made. Robert's business ventures, which had always seemed robust and unshakable, began to crumble under the weight of scandal and neglect. The news was subtle at first, a quiet whisper among former partners, a canceled contract, a missed deadline, but soon it grew louder and more damaging. One of his key clients pulled out, citing concerns about his unreliable leadership. Another partner quietly distanced himself, unwilling to be tied to a man whose personal life was now public drama. Robert's reputation, once pristine in the local community, was tarnishing rapidly, and the stress carved deep lines into his face. I saw it during the rare phone calls he dared make, his voice strained, defensive, a brittle mask barely concealing panic. Linda's social circle, the very group she had once dazzled with her charm and grace, began to retreat. Invitations she had taken for granted stopped arriving, and old friends who had once been pillars of support now offered little more than awkward silence when our names came up. I knew how much she prized appearances, and this slow erosion of her social standing was a quiet but profound blow. The bravado she displayed in texts and calls to me was just a fragile veneer over the fear that she was losing control, not just over Emily's care, but over the carefully constructed life she'd tried to build. As their world began to collapse, Robert's health declined as well. The man who had always presented himself as strong and unyielding was becoming a shadow of himself. There were moments when he'd call, his voice thick with exhaustion and frustration, complaining of chest pains and sleepless nights. I urged him to see a doctor, but his pride and denial often won out. Still, I sensed the physical toll their unraveling was taking, a cruel echo of the emotional damage their choices had inflicted on Emily. Their desperation brought out new and old tactics. Robert and Linda started playing the victim in earnest, flooding my phone with messages portraying themselves as misunderstood and unfairly attacked. There were pleas for forgiveness, promises to change, and veiled threats about tearing the family apart if I didn't relent. At times, their words seemed genuine enough to spark a flicker of doubt, but I had learned to see through their manipulation. Every interaction was now carefully documented. Texts, phone calls, emails, all stored away like evidence in a case that had become as much legal as emotional. They also enlisted relatives to pressure me, reaching out to cousins, aunts, and even some of Emily's teachers, trying to rally support for their side. Messages from family members urged me to keep the peace, to remember what family means, and to give mom and dad another chance. But even among these relatives, opinions were divided. Some expressed sympathy for my position, quietly acknowledging the neglect Emily had suffered. Others clung to denial, unwilling to confront the damage. I listened politely but held my ground, knowing that true healing could only come from accountability, not silence. Mark, who had once been the golden child basking in unearned privilege, was not immune to the consequences. Friends began to withdraw, sensing the growing scandal and uncomfortable with the secrets that were now surfacing. Whispers about the Thornton family's dysfunction started to circulate in social circles where Mark had previously been untouchable. His once confident demeanor cracked under the pressure, and I saw glimpses of uncertainty where there had only been arrogance before. The carefully maintained image he'd relied on was fracturing, and with it, his ability to shield himself behind family loyalty. Throughout these escalating tensions, I remained firm and unwavering. The emotional weight was immense. There were nights when the guilt gnawed at me, haunting my dreams, and the backlash was isolating. But I reminded myself that this was no longer about preserving a fragile illusion of family. It was about protecting Emily's future from the very people who had disregarded her safety and well-being. The boundaries I set were not walls to keep my family out. They were shields to keep Emily safe. As the Thornton family's reputation and cohesion unraveled, I could see new possibilities beginning to take shape. For the first time, there was no denying the cost of their neglect. The storm was far from over, but the course was clear. Accountability, not denial, would define what came next, and I was ready to weather whatever consequences that path demanded, for Emily's sake and hers alone. The day I finally set firm boundaries with my family was one of the most difficult, yet strangely liberating moments I've ever experienced. After years of bending, absorbing, defending, and hoping, I realized that genuine protection for Emily could only come with clear, non-negotiable terms. It wasn't enough to simply love her or shield her behind whispered promises. I had to establish rules that demanded respect, honesty, and above all, the prioritization of her welfare. I told Robert, Linda, and Mark that any future contact with Emily or with me would be contingent on three things: respect for our decisions as her guardians, honesty and communication about anything relating to her care, and a genuine commitment to put Emily's needs above their own desires or control. No more manipulations, no more dismissals, no more cruel lessons disguised as discipline. If they couldn't abide by these terms, then our relationship, especially their relationship with Emily, would be suspended indefinitely. It was a line drawn with clarity and conviction, and there was no room for negotiation. Jason stood beside me throughout this process, a steady and unwavering force. His calm presence helped anchor me when the weight of what I was doing threatened to crush my resolve. Together, we focused on creating a nurturing environment, not just for Emily, but for our entire family. Our home became a sanctuary filled with warmth, laughter, and the kind of patience Emily had rarely experienced before. We filled it with small rituals, bedtime stories read in soft voices, weekend outings where her curiosities were encouraged, and simple dinners where she could speak without fear or judgment. Watching Emily begin to blossom in this safe space was a profound reminder of what every child deserves. Slowly, her shoulders straightened, her eyes regained their sparkle. When she smiled, it wasn't out of habit or politeness, but a genuine sense of security and belonging. It was painful to contrast that growth with the years she had spent navigating a family landscape marked by neglect and indifference. But it was also a testament to the power of love combined with firm, protective boundaries. Meanwhile, Robert and Linda faced the stark reality of their choices. The comfortable, often unchecked control they had wielded over our family was gone. The house that once symbolized stability was now a looming reminder of their consequences. Their attempts to plead, manipulate, or charm their way back into Emily's life were met with a boundary I held firmly: respect and care first. Promises without change were no longer enough. I knew this was a painful reckoning for them, but it was necessary. Blood ties, after all, don't automatically guarantee loyalty or love. True family is built on trust, respect, and mutual care, not on fear, neglect, or control. While I still hoped for genuine change, I was prepared for the possibility that their choices might lead to permanent estrangement. Protecting Emily had to come before preserving a toxic status quo. In those quiet moments when the battle-laden conversations faded, I found a deep, unexpected peace in reclaiming control, not just over Emily's safety, but over my own role within this fractured family. I was no longer the silent sufferer, the emotional crutch, or the overlooked sister. I was her guardian, her advocate, and the architect of a better future. Through this painful journey, I learned that setting boundaries isn't about building walls to shut people out. It's about creating safe spaces where healing can begin. It's about saying enough to patterns that harm and yes, to hope that a child's worth can finally be honored. Emily's future is still unfolding. There are challenges ahead, no doubt. But now, instead of walking a tightrope over an emotional abyss, she is surrounded by adults who see her, hear her, and cherish her. And in that simple truth lies the profound lesson I intend to teach my family: that love, respect, and protection are not optional. They are essential.